Good morning. Thank you for joining the Reformed Institute of Metropolitan Washington for this learning experience on Reform Political Thought and the Crisis of Democracy, presented by Dr. R. Bruce Douglas. Over the next 4 weeks, Bruce will lead us through a critical examination of and dialogue on the relevance of certain key ideas in the Reformed Protestant political tradition to the current crisis of democratic politics. As a member of the Company of Teachers, we certainly are grateful to Bruce for this presentation. Please join the Board of Directors, the Executive Director, Dr. Larry Goldman, and me in welcoming Dr. R. Bruce Douglas. Bruce?
You should have received, in preparation for this event, two documents. One, a list of readings called Foundational Texts for the Reformed Political Tradition. I'm going to be making reference to that this morning, so have that at hand. And then another list, which is the readings for the course. The readings are designed purely to supplement what is going to be discussed in each of these sessions. I think they will enrich your appreciation of the things we're going to be talking about if you've done the reading. All of the readings are available online, except for a couple of them, and the Reformed Institute, Larry and Yvonne have graciously provided those as well, the ones that are not available online. So everybody should have easy access to all of the readings. We're going to be in these sessions for 2.5 hours. And I was commenting earlier on the virtues of Zoom. I'm going to now briefly mention one of the vices. And I'm not, as a retired person, I'm not exposed to this nearly as much as, for example, my children are, who spend hours and hours and hours on Zoom. It's not a good thing to be just focused on a screen for hours and hours, and even 2.5 hours is a bit long. So I'm going to just promise you the following. We will get a break midway through these sessions. And there will be, at every interval as they go along, there will be opportunities for some discussion. I'm sure you've already learned now, as an experienced Zoom users of the Zoom platform, that when you need to, just check out for a few minutes and then you can check back in. I'm just taking that for granted that everybody's going to be doing that as needed. In every session, I will provide for a break in the middle of maybe 10 minutes. There will be sort of idle chatter during that 10 minutes, but that will take place so that you can get your second cup of coffee or your third or whatever, and use the facilities and do whatever is necessary in that brief period. So we're running from 9:30 until noon, and somewhere around 10:30 there will be a brief break as we go. And now, about this morning's, the structure of this morning's agenda, I will be talking about the Reformed political tradition, making reference to this document that we distributed, and the reading you've done in Calvin in the first roughly 45 minutes. Try to make a presentation about that topic, 45 minutes or so, which will bring us up to 10:30, and then take a break, and then we'll have some discussion of that. And I invite you to pose whatever questions, make whatever comments you have. When you deal with a document as important as Calvin's discussion of civil government, you could easily talk for a long time. I'm going to try to make my comments relatively focused and abbreviated, but I do invite you to offer your own thoughts in that period of discussion that we will have. And then roughly in the last hour, 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock, I will then make another briefer presentation on the Puritans, and in particular John Winthrop, and then a fascinating character about which you may not have heard before. And it's appalling that Presbyterians have not heard of this person before, Benjamin Rush, a great hero in my mind. And I think it'll become evident to you why I think that. I've asked you to do just a brief selection from Benjamin Rush to give you a sense of the flavor of his thinking. All right, let's start now. First of all, any questions or objections about that, the procedure? Are we ready to go? Good, let's go. I want to, in my very brief remarks on the Reformed political tradition, before I get to Calvin, just refer you to this list of foundational texts, 12 of them, and tell you why I put it together and made it available to you. It is designed to illustrate a point. There are 12 names there. My guess is, some of you are very well-read people. My guess is that some of you have heard some of those names. I'm guessing that not many of you have read many of them. But these are very important texts, not just in the history of Reformed Christianity, but in the history of political theory, political thought, in the period that we're talking about. It's a period, note the dates there, I've put them in chronological order. They run from the mid-16th century, the 1550s roughly, through the end of the next century, 1680s and 1690s. So we're talking about a period of about 140, 150 years. And I'm going to characterize that as the foundational period in the development of Reformed political thought. Let me say that again. That's the foundational period. That's when the foundations are laid in the period. And I'm going to separate that from what comes later, because in that period, you have just a turbulence, the turbulence flowing out of the Reformation, political and religious. And let me just say, with this group, we all live in difficult and maybe even turbulent times. The turbulence that we're experiencing now is nothing compared to the turbulence that was experienced in that period by our spiritual forebears. It was just a kind of upheaval. The Reformation was a political as well as a religious upheaval, with refugees streaming across the face of Europe, with wars being fought, with armies ravaging the land. We've been reminded of what that can mean for at least 100 years. As the different, you might say, factions of Christendom struggled against one another for control and influence in much of Western Europe. So it's that period that I'm talking about, and that is the period in which the foundations of our Reformed political tradition were laid. Now, the point I want to make about it is this. Those are 12 texts, and it could have been 50. Believe you me, this is just a sample. It could have been 50, but these are the most important ones, the most prominent ones, and they're all serious. They're all articulations of serious ideas by intellectually serious people. Let me say that again: serious ideas by intellectually serious people. And by serious ideas, I mean everybody's got opinions, but the question is, what is the basis of those opinions? Serious ideas are held by people who can give you the reasons and give you the reasons in a way that are persuasive. And that separates out so many people, so many thinkers from, I would say, the rest of humanity. These are people with very serious ideas, articulating them well, and all of these works had profound influence on the shape of events in their own time. I haven't got time to go into that. If this were a university course, we would talk about the effect of different ones on different countries. And by the way, you can see they come from different places. This illustrates the international character of Reformed Protestantism in this period. They're Dutch and French and English and so forth. Now, I lined them up in order to make this point. In this period, there is a flood of writing by Reformed Christians about politics, a flood of writing, and it's writing of very high quality. And I want to say this is unusual compared to some other traditions. In this period, everybody who was involved in the great struggle to some extent had to think about politics. Even the Anabaptists had to think about politics, who wanted to run away from politics. They thought it was kind of wrong for Christians to seek political power. It was contrary to the gospel. But the Lutherans, the Anglicans, and of course all the Roman Catholic leaders, they were all caught up in the need to think about politics. But the Reformed Christians in particular, were drawn to this and just produced a flood of writing, which is influential at the time and becomes even more influential in the years to come. Now, the obvious question, just to me, it's just a fascinating question, is why this flood? And particularly, why this flood from Reformed Christians when you didn't? There really is nothing comparable. I'm going to say this probably if there's a Lutheran in the room, they're going to object to this, but I think it's true. There's nothing comparable in the Lutheran world. There just isn't. There is something comparable in the Roman Catholic world, and it's produced almost entirely by clergy. Let me say that again. It's produced almost entirely by clergy. This tradition is I'll illustrate this in just a minute. But if you look at this tradition, it is as much the work of lay people as it is clergy. And that's not an accident. That's not an accident. It's the work of lay people as well as clergy. And I think it reflects lay experience in civil affairs in a way that, say, Roman Catholic political thought does not. Now, going back to my question, you get a flood, and that, of course, at least for the intellectual historian, raises a fascinating, why this flood? Why this flood among these Reformed people and not among other traditions, at least to the same extent? And I want to suggest 3 reasons. You could give 50 reasons, but I want to give you 3 reasons that have always been in my mind as I've thought about this tradition. The first is that the way Reformed Protestants defined the Reformation project, let me put it that way, the way Reformed Christians defined the Reformation project, they were drawn inexorably into politics. Let me say that again. The way they defined the project of reforming the church and more broadly reforming society drew them naturally in a political direction. You can't say that about everybody in the Reformation. You can't say that, going back to my foil here, you can't say that about the Anabaptists. They were kind of, as much as possible, trying to avoid that contamination that came from wielding political power. The Reform, by and large, the Reform movement drew people in just the opposite direction. They were drawn to exercise power. They wanted power. They sought power. And when they didn't get it, it was a disappointment that they had to deal with. And by the way, I would say that has been true right down through the decades, right down through the centuries. Reformed people not only have been drawn to exercise civil power, they've been comfortable using it, and it's been part of their way of thinking about how you achieve a discipleship in this world. That's the first reason. The second reason, and these are related, of course, the second reason is that in the Reformed tradition, you get a very, what I would characterize as elevated or high appreciation of politics. An elevated or high appreciation of politics. That is not true of much of Christianity. And it was a great debate in Roman Catholicism as to whether you should have a high and lofty view of politics or a rather negative view of politics. I'm going to get to that more when we talk about Calvin. There was a huge tension in Roman Catholicism about that whole topic. And in contrast, in the Reformed tradition, there was a kind of ringing affirmation of the fact that civil government was God's creation and it was providential. It was God's creation and it was providential, and therefore it was entirely appropriate not only for Christians to get involved in politics, but to think of politics as a calling. I mean, to think about the weight of that word, a calling. And I'll point out to you as we get to Calvin. Calvin goes even higher on that scale. Well, if you're hearing in sermons, and I always say to clergy, be careful what you preach. If you're listening to sermons with that theme constantly coming up, then naturally, when you're drawn to politics, it's not just a matter of necessity. It is something which you value. You think it's a worthy vocation for you to pursue. And then finally, the third thing that I would say that produces this flood, and it's just remarkable. I mean, as you go down and read these texts and think about their historical influence, you think, at least I do, I think, wow, what an explosion, what an explosion. and an explosion which changed things, not just in the Reformed world, but more broadly. The third reason I would give you is, as our forebears got into this topic and started writing and thinking about it, and of course, all the thinking was intertwined with practical experience, like making revolutions and getting put in jail and being sent into exile and all that sort of thing, or being sent across the ocean in the case of Winthrop. They found it necessary to innovate, and innovate in very important ways with regard to the fundamental topics. So that impelled them, if you will, to write. The more they thought about these things, they said, well, you've got to really express, I have a different view on this than the inherited wisdom. I have a different view, and then to explain the reasons for that. The foundational period, as I've said, runs from about a century and a half. It runs about a century and a half. It's pretty well over by the late 1600s. Let me say that again. And you'll look at, that's why this list is constituted the way it's done by the late 1600s. Things change, conditions change, and in turn, Reformed political thought changes in the centuries that come after that. Why do I say that? Let me just go back and repeat what I said at the beginning. In this period, from the 1550s through the late end of the 17th century, there is a kind of unsettled quality to the interplay of religion and politics in Western Europe. Let me say that again. There's an unsettled quality to the interplay of religion and politics in Western Europe. They're still fighting for territory. Will this country be Catholic? Will it be Anglican? Will it be Lutheran, or so forth? By the end of the 17th century, that is pretty well done. And you get a period in which the intellectual climate and the political climate changes. And one of the most important changes that emerges, and many of you know this well, is the Enlightenment. And the ideas which fed into, by that stream, in contrast to the Reformed political tradition, the American founding. The 18th century is a different time. The 19th century is a different time. The 20th century is a different time. And broadly, what I'm going to say is this: what happens after the founding is that the tradition, the ideas which were sort of articulated as the basis of the Reformed political thought, then begin to get adapted and changed in subsequent centuries, adapted and changed. So that if you were to go through the whole story, and we're not dealing with a compressed version of it as I'm doing here in just 2 sessions, you would see that gradually over time, important things get changed while other things are continuity. Final thing I want to say by way of introduction, let me just say it one more time. This tradition is as much the work of lay people as it is clergy. And I say that in part because I am, having spent my entire professional life in a Roman Catholic institution, that's one of the things which strikes me profoundly about the difference between Protestant traditions, plural, and Roman Catholic. I want to name the lay people so that you'll get a sense of this. As you go down the list, George Buchanan is a lay person. Johannes Althusius is a lay person. Hugo Grotius, the great father of international law, he's a big deal. He's one of the early articulators of an idea which is now terribly important in our public life, and that is there needs to be international institutions which restrict and control the behavior of would-be tyrants. That's Grotius, a very, very active Reformed Christian. And then John Milton and Algernon Sidney, all of those people are lay people. So you've got a tradition here which is very much the collaborative effort of Roman Catholic, of clergy and lay people. Now, I'm sure that raises a lot of questions in your mind, but I'm going to we'll get to those questions hopefully in a moment, but I want, for reasons of time, to move directly from that to talk about John Calvin. And in this presentation on Calvin, I'm going to link it to what I said before in the following way. Calvin is by far, of all of those figures, the most important. Let me say that again. Calvin is by far the most important. He's not only the first, but he's also, at least the first in the way I've listed it there, but the most important. As things evolve, as things develop, all of these figures, going all the way down the list, and then later we'll talk about later figures like Kuyper and Barth, they all refer back to Calvin. Calvin is a reference point. Calvin is an influence even when they disagree with him. So Calvin quickly becomes, in political thought as much as theology, almost more than theology, he becomes sort of the reference point for the conversation. And that's why this text that I've asked you to read for this morning is so important, because more than anything else, that text, the 20th chapter of the 4th book of the Institutes, is the statement about civil politics that people in later generations and in other parts of Europe and later other parts of the world referred to as the sort of the quintessential statement of Calvin's thinking. Just a few words about his life at times. I'm just loath always when talking about serious thinkers to treat them in a way that ignores their life and times, because there's always a connection between their life and times and their ideas. He was a Frenchman, of course. His real name was Jean Cauvin. It comes as a shock, I've learned, in teaching in churches to say that, but it's true. His real name was not John Calvin. It was Jean Cauvin, C-A-U-V-I-N. He would not have answered to John Calvin. Cauvin, Jean Cauvin. Jean Cauvin was raised with the expectation initially that he would become a clergyman, but he, for a variety of reasons, turned in another direction and was trained in a very elaborate way as a jurist. He was a lawyer. Let me say that again. Some of you know that well, but it's a very important thing, and it's not incidental to this topic. He was a lawyer. He had the mind of a lawyer. I heard a scholar recently comment on this. He said, if Calvin had pursued a different course, he probably would have been an eminent high-level French jurist, like Supreme Court kind of level jurist. So he had the mind of somebody who thought in that way, and in the French way, as a jurist. He was well trained, had pursued graduate study in that field, was preparing to move into that field when he had a conversion experience. It's very interesting that he talks very little in his writings about that conversion experience. Very, some people would go on and on and on about the conversion experience. Calvin has very little to say about it, except that it profoundly changed his life. As what we would now characterize as a sort of advanced graduate student, he has a conversion experience and dedicates himself to the cause of the reform. The reform. And by the way, why do we use that word reform? It's because it was the common word in that time to describe our sort of Protestant reform. And later, of course, Dutch reform, French reform. Larry will testify much of the reform world still identifies itself ecclesiastically in that way. He was converted to the cause of the reform and very quickly thereafter left France. And it was clearly because there was some danger in espousing the position that he was about to espouse. He was a refugee. Very important thing to note. John Calvin was a refugee. He spent his whole life as a refugee. He spent his whole life in a town that became a center for the flood of refugees coming from much of Western Europe as a result of the political turbulence, the political and religious turbulence. I think about that often. I think that's a very important thing to note. I'll come back and say more about it in just a second. He went first to Basel as a young man. I envision him as a typical graduate student floating through Western Europe. But he was not typical at all, because in Basel, in a few months, he drafted, just as his contribution, I love the in quotation marks, just as his contribution to this developing cause, a little handbook, the first draft of the Institutes. The first draft of the Institutes, which was designed as a sort of simple exposition of the basic ideas of this movement, the basic theological and other ideas of this movement. It was very short. It was only a few dozen pages. And of course, over time, it expanded. He wrote that work over and over and over and over again until it, well, you know, the length that it now has. The final version apparently appeared in 1559. And even then he was anxious to maybe make some more changes, but that's basically the edition we now have. He migrated from Basel to Geneva He found himself in Geneva by accident. He was just moving through Geneva and on the way somewhere else when he was recognized as the author of this little handbook and asked by the man who was Guillaume Farel, the man who was in charge of the project of the Reformation, reforming the church and society in Geneva, to help him. He agreed to do that, and after a brief period away in Strasbourg, he comes back in 1541, and note these dates, 1541 to 1564 is the leader of the Reformation, the project of the Reformation in Geneva. Geneva at the time was a republic. It had been for a long time under the rule of a prince, and therefore it was a principality, but in the 1530s achieved its independence. That's an important theme here. Its independence, and became a self-governing city-state. And take note of this. It was governed by two tiers of city councils, elected city councils. And those city councils, made up of lay people, were the people with whom Calvin had to deal on practically everything, because religious affairs, as well as taxes and everything else, were governed by the city council. Calvin never had political power. Let me say that again. Never had political power. Never wielded political power. The question of whether or not Geneva was a theocracy is a very complicated question precisely for that reason. He never had political power, and indeed he thought it was inappropriate for ecclesiastical leaders to wield political power in that sense. So the most he had was influence. He had enormous influence as time went by, but he also had opponents in the city council. And the city council changed because there were elections again and again. Sometimes the people in the city council were more, shall we say, favorably disposed to Calvin than at other times. He had to deal in all that period with, shall we say, the sort of the shifting dynamics of what we today would call electoral politics, the shifting dynamics of electoral politics. They authorized him to provide leadership in the reformation of the church in Geneva, and he did it. Boy, did he do it with a vengeance. He was a very effective leader, but he also had opponents and had to deal with those opponents. And sometimes they just disagreed with him on certain things and overruled him. The one thing that I think is worth noting by way of policy, I've already alluded to it, and I want to come back to it. In the course of his time in Geneva, the population of the city-state, it actually was, canton, the city-state of Geneva doubled. And it doubled because of immigrants. It doubled because of immigrants. It went from a population of about 5,000 to 10,000, mainly in the 1550s, when there was a stream of refugees coming in, mainly from France, but not just France. And there was a big issue in Geneva, how to deal with these refugees and how open the borders should be, if you will. And Calvin himself, another thing to note, was not a citizen until 1559. So for much of that period, he is somebody who is a supplicant in relation to the people who are citizens, who do wield political power. He finally got citizenship in 1559, near the end of his life. I'm going to do a dangerous thing and offer a summary sentence about his aim. What was he trying to do in Geneva? I referred earlier to the Reformation project. Every different strain of Protestantism had a conception of what the aim was, the goal was. I would say in Calvin's case, it was the following: to create not just a reformed church, but a way of life conducive to righteous living. Let me say that again: a whole way of life conducive to righteous living. And politics played a role, had a place in that. Now, with that as background, let me go to talk about in a selective way what I think is important in the statement on civil government in the Institutes, the thing that I ask you to read. I want to stress it's such a rich text discussing so many different things that you could easily spend several classes, if we had them, simply sort of teasing out the parts about capital punishment, the part about war, all kinds of different things. I'm going to try to keep us rather narrowly focused on the parts of that exposition there that are relevant to our topic, which is the right crisis of democratic institutions. Question number one. There's 6 topics I'm going to be raising here. Number one, why does civil government exist? Arguably the most foundational question in every piece of political theory worth reading. Why does civil government exist? That's related, of course, to other closely linked questions about its purpose. But in the first instance, it's appropriate to say, why does civil government exist? Now, I referred earlier to a tradition, a long tradition in Christian thinking about politics, which answers that question in essentially a negative way. The father of that, in my opinion, is St. Augustine, the city of God. The city of God, which is the foundation of what, ironically, I think right now is the source of a certain strain of Christian political thought called Augustinian. It's enjoying a kind of renaissance. I'm not quite sure why that is, but there is a strain of, among ethicists and others, who are talking a lot about Augustinian political thought. Augustine is the father of this negative view, and another figure who is terribly important in adding to the point of view that I'm about to articulate is Martin Luther. Martin Luther had a very negative view of civil government, especially as compared with Calvin. Indeed, it's one of the most important things to grasp in thinking about the difference between Lutheran tendencies with regard to political thought and Reformed tendencies with regard to political thought. The answer that Augustine gave, and he gave it in a very colorful way, saying some really snotty things about Roman emperors and civil authorities in his own day. The answer that Augustine gave to the question, why does civil government exist? It is nothing but a remedy for sin, full stop. It is nothing but a remedy for sin. It wouldn't exist, in other words, if there hadn't been the fall. It is an institution or set of institutions which have been put here by God on the earth, drawing human beings in that direction, in order to protect us from the worst harm that human beings can inflict through their sinfulness. And we're being reminded in our own time of how awful the harms that human beings can inflict on one another can be. Well, living as Augustine did and as Luther did, in a time when there was a lot of political turbulence and a lot of nastiness, you could easily imagine how somebody could flesh out that argument well. The reason why we've got the state is to protect us against the criminal element in our own society, but also the evil designs of people who are in other countries who want to take us over, want to in one way or another inflict harm on us. The picture they paint is human beings are essentially beasts to one another, and they have enormous destructive tendencies. They're rapacious, they're destructive, and we need some protection against that. And thank God for the police. Thank God for the army. That's the argument here. Now, Calvin. By the way, Luther, I would say, in some respects, is even more sort of lurid in his discussion. Now, Calvin, interestingly enough, accepts all of that. If you've done the reading, you know that he does acknowledge that that's part of the reason why we have civil government. That's part of the reason why, as a matter of fact, he says we need it. We desperately need it. We need civil government. But he refuses to leave it there. And this is just so pivotal in thinking about the whole Reformed political tradition, because everybody who comes after him is drawn to this, I would say, more positive view of civil government and its role in human affairs. What other purposes does civil government have? Well, for one thing, it provides justice in human affairs. That's the different matter than peace and security. Justice is and that's a recurring theme for Calvin. Justice, making sure that people rightly receive what they deserve. Justice is an important part of it. But he goes on to say, civil government, when it does its job at all well, creates an environment which is conducive to virtuous living. Virtuous living. If government does its job well, then it creates an environment that enables people to be upright in their own personal affairs and even to treat one another with some kindness. You know, take away the rapaciousness, and then you get something that moves in the direction, especially if the laws are well written, the laws are well administered, you're going to get a society in which it is more possible for people to be kind and generous and just in their dealings with one another. And even, he says, it is possible, if government does its job well, for the environment to be such that it is conducive to genuine piety or righteousness. Now, I hope you see that's a rather elevated notion of the function of civil government. He then goes on to say, and these are the things which, every time I think about the Reformed tradition and the way in which it developed, these words just echo in my thought. He says, and in one kind of interesting turn of phrase, he says, public office is certainly honorable, but it's not just honorable. It is, if public office is exercised at all appropriately, it can be a sacred calling, a sacred calling. And then he says, just to complete the picture here, and all of these are just within a few sentences, but these sentences become terribly important in the later development of Reformed political thought. I think, he says, it's appropriate to think of our civil rulers as people who are capable of performing through their political work a ministry, calling, ministry. These are very different ideas than simply keeping order. And indeed, what flows out of this is a certain idea, a certain image of what a good ruler looks like. A good ruler is somebody who is deeply pious and at the same time is dedicated to taking seriously as much as possible the moral and spiritual demands of government. The whole tradition of the public official as a person who has a sacred trust that as much as possible should be honored in practice. Or to put it now, to complete the picture, the good ruler is somebody who is literally the opposite in every important way of the tyrant. Literally the opposite of he's not only is he morally grounded, he's somebody who has a very strong conviction about what is right and wrong and is determined to do it. That's topic number one. Topic number two, what is the best form of government? There's a deep ambiguity in what Calvin has to say about this topic, but it's an ambiguity which was very, very fruitfully exploited by later thinkers. And what he had to say about this topic was highly influential. Ambiguity would be a generous way to put it. Some people say, in commenting on Calvin, that when it comes to this topic, he's just contradictory. And I can concede that, although I'm inclined to say it's more complicated than that. He begins by saying something that I think is absolutely true. I'll just make a political pronouncement on this. He says, in principle, it is problematic to pronounce on the best form of government because the best form of government will depend upon circumstances. What form of government is desirable will depend upon circumstances, and we need to think of it in that way. We need to have a kind of contextually flexible approach in thinking about this topic. I will say that I think that there's a warning there about universalist claims. The best form of government around the world is, no. It depends a lot on circumstances, what conditions prevail, and so forth. Then he says the following: all the preferred forms of government, as the great thinkers of the past have defined them, have something to say for them. And he names three: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. All three of them have something to be said for them. Although he's rather skeptical about democracy. I hope you pick that up. He's rather skeptical about democracy. He says they all have something to be said for them, but, and this leads me to my next point, if you think about it well, I'm reading between the lines here, he doesn't say this quite bluntly, but if you think about this well, if you think about it deeply, you will probably see that the best form of government, and here we get to the heart of the matter, the best form of government is aristocracy mixed with some elements of democracy. Aristocracy mixed with some elements of democracy. Aristocracy meaning, and this is, again, a kind of standard theme in Reformed thought as things develop, is tipping his hat to aristocracy doesn't mean, do not think about Downton Abbey. That's not what we're talking about when we say aristocracy. We're talking about aristocracy in the pure sense. That is, people who are superior in skill, superior in knowledge. That's what he means. In every society, he says, in politics, just like other spheres of life, there are people who are superior in skill, and those are the aristocratic elements, and they should have a lion's share of authority and power. But it needs to be mixed with democracy. It's a kind of mix of the two. And I'll get to the details of that in just a second. But what's emerging here is something which becomes a very important idea in the Reformed tradition. What we really want is a mixed regime, not a pure regime, but a mixed regime. Now, having said that, let me back up and ask a question about why he jumps so easily to aristocracy and not monarchy. And the answer is Calvin, from the get-go, had a deep suspicion of monarchy. That is relevant to our topic. We will come back and talk about that a lot in the latter 2 weeks of this course. He had a deep suspicion of democracy, of monarchy, and interestingly enough, he thought that was biblical. Let me say that again. He thought that was biblical. By the way, let me say parenthetically, one of the more important features of Reformed political thought is the extent to which the arguments are cast primarily in terms of biblical precedents. Very different from Roman Catholic thought on this topic, especially Old Testament precedents. And one of the lessons that Calvin drew from the Old Testament, his extensive study of the Old Testament, think of all those biblical commentaries that he wrote, is that there was a feeling among Israelites that God did not really approve of monarchy. He finally gave the Israelites a monarchy, but he didn't approve of monarchy. Why? Because monarchy was filled with enormous temptations for human sinfulness. Enormous temptations for human sinfulness, which could easily lead to abuse of power. He actually uses that phrase. In contrast, aristocracy, meaning a plurality of people, it offers a different kind of circumstance. And by the way, so much of the struggle in the 16th and 17th century in Western Europe is over the question of absolute monarchy. In one society after another, you have Henry VIII figures in one place after another, trying to draw unto themselves all the power that they can in order to, they would say, modernize the country. And generally, Reformed Christians were on the other side of that all the way along. We're opposed to absolutism, political absolutism, especially in the monarchical form. So he's opposed to monarchy, and he got more opposed to monarchy the more time went by, as he saw monarchs sort of treating the issues that had to be addressed in the struggles over the Reformation. He was, another way to put this is to say that he was very sensitive to the danger of tyranny. I'll talk about what that means in a moment. The danger of tyranny. He saw emerging in so many places in Western Europe the tyrannical tendencies of strong national governments as they were emerging, and he was opposed to that. One final observation here. In the conclusion of the segment of chapter 20, where he talks about this topic, he says, as a throwaway line, why not just a pure aristocracy? No. It is better for the people to have a say. For the people to have a say. In other words, if there's going to be an aristocratic element ruling, the people should have some say in who those people are and how long they rule. Thus you get in Calvin the beginning of the idea of a mixed government, of mixing aristocratic and democratic elements. Or, and now I'm going to jump ahead to something which we'll see more fully when we get to Rush, This is the basis of what becomes the Republican idea, a republic. And that's a very important theme in this whole course that we'll be talking about. Thirdly, third topic, resistance to tyrants. What is a tyrant? A tyrant is somebody who violates fundamental law, fundamental assumptions about human decency. Fundamental law, fundamental assumptions about human decency. And that is linked to something I'll talk about in just a second, the premise of constitutionalism, that civil power and its exercise should be limited by basic assumptions about human decency and the way in which human beings should be treated. A tyrant is somebody who rides roughshod over those, sometimes Calvin characterizes them as the teaching of conscience. The teaching of conscience. People just know in their hearts that there are certain things you shouldn't do, and yet the tyrant will do them anyway. Calvin, again, in this, talking about this terribly important topic, which was central to so much of the debates going on among Reformed Christians in his lifetime and then beyond. Is it appropriate to resist tyrants? Is it appropriate to rebel? Is it appropriate to make a revolution? Calvin is torn, obviously. And he's torn for maybe obvious practical reasons. He's very clear that a violent uprising by the people is not a good idea. A violent uprising by the people is not a good idea. Indeed, he goes so far as to say it's criminal behavior and it is contrary to the will of God. But then he goes on to say, reading his Bible, thinking about this problem, and frankly, writing letters to people in England and Scotland and all over. You know, this is a topic of correspondence as Calvin is advising people on what to do in the Netherlands or whatever. Sometimes it is the case, he says, that God raises up a leader to resist and actually defeat tyrants. Sometimes it is the case. He said, and the most obvious case, he says, is Moses. The Israelites are suffering under a tyrant, and then what happens? God empowers this, and then he uses a very important phrase, this lesser magistrate to take action that will undermine the authority of the tyrant. And he characterizes those people, these lesser magistrates, who assume some position of responsibility, even though they're not the official leaders, the top leaders. He says, sometimes we have to assume that those people are armed with authority from heaven. Armed with authority from heaven. Topic number 4. What did he believe was the desirable relationship between church and state? The simple answer is they should be collaborating. There is no sense in Calvin of a separation of church and state of the kind to which we're accustomed. That comes later in the development of the Reformed tradition, and it does develop in the Reformed tradition, but it certainly wasn't present at the outset. Indeed, Calvin goes so far as to suggest the following: no government can be well constituted if its main object is not the promotion of piety. That's not exactly ACLU talk. No government can be well constituted if its main object is not the promotion of piety. How does it do that? Well, in the first instance, it provides peace and security. And he has a very eloquent discussion of that. He says, it's very difficult for the church to conduct its work, to do its ministry, if there is not peace and security in the land. So that's the most obvious thing. But beyond that, he says, what the church needs to be doing, what the state needs to be doing is adopting laws and policies which are in keeping with the teaching of the church. Laws and policies which are in keeping with the teaching of the church. And above all, he says, laws and policies which are in keeping with the 10 Commandments. One of the big themes in Calvin is the continuing importance of the 10 Commandments in the lives of Christians. It's a big difference between the Reformed tradition and Luther's rather casual dismissal of the authority of the Old Testament law. And that brings me to my next topic, which is a very important theme in Reformed thought. It's less developed in Calvin than it comes later, but it's there in Calvin, and that's the following. The rule of law, in a certain sense. Calvin is a believer in the rule of law. I've already alluded to the fact that it's the foundation of his thinking about tyrants. How do we judge somebody as a tyrant? Well, there are criteria, he would say, and they are constitutional criteria. Two senses in which that is true. In the minimal sense in which law needs to be observed, you might say fundamental law, or what eventually becomes constitutional law, the minimal sense in which that needs to be observed is the following. Calvin was a believer in natural law. Sometimes that is not appreciated fully. Calvin was a believer in natural law, but by natural law, he meant what? He meant the dictates of conscience, the dictates of conscience among human beings generally. You have to be a Christian to see those dictates of conscience. And he made a point of saying people of many different beliefs have these dictates of conscience, and the dictates of conscience have to do with the most basic things: human decency, fairness. And they give us really good guidance for understanding what should be the way in which we interact with one another. But Calvin also was a believer in the following, that the Decalogue was something which should be looked upon as a kind of constitutional foundation for understanding the function of civil government. And that meant the first table as well as the second table of the Decalogue should be understood to be part of the foundation on which government is based. And that meant, and this is something, of course, which differentiates Calvin from eventually people in the Reformed tradition who differ with him on this, but at the beginning, he believed in laws designed to discourage blasphemy, heresy, and religious strife. That's part of what is involved in creating a community of a way of life which is conducive to righteous living. The final theme I want to talk about, with just a couple of minutes to go, is the following. The one that we'll get into a lot more in the weeks to come, and that is liberty. Liberty. The topic of liberty is a very complicated and fraught issue at the time that Calvin was writing. And I wanted to explain just in a few words what the complication was. Luther wrote as part of his, you might say, foundational works, something called The Freedom of the Christian Man. If you have been exposed to Luther before, you may have read that, and it really bears rereading. It's a very provocative document. Early on in the development of his thought, he wrote this treatise called The Freedom of the Christian Man. And it was a bold assertion over against all sorts of restrictions that people had lived under, a bold assertion of the appropriateness of people casting off those restrictions and living, you might say, in a kind of Christian freedom. He wrote that especially with regard to all sorts of restraints and restrictions which Roman Catholics had imposed upon people's lives. All that he thought was just nonsense. We need to step away from that, all that legalistic confinement of our lives, and assert boldly our right to live as free men and women. Now, that assertion quickly led to something which Roman Catholics took advantage of and others took advantage of in their polemics against Luther and more broadly against Protestants. And that was, they said it was an invitation to anarchy. It was an invitation to anarchy, especially if it were applied politically. And people got the idea that as good Christians, they didn't really have to obey all kinds of laws. And that in turn became the basis on which in France and in other places, people who were critics of Protestantism oftentimes, and with a broad brush, said all those Protestants are essentially anarchists, and their behavior is subversive of public order. Now, one of the most interesting things about Calvin is very sensitive to that, and ultimately produces a position which is quite different. Calvin's position has sometimes been characterized, and he actually uses this phrase occasionally, but more often it's been used by later interpreters to characterize his position. Calvin is an advocate of what might be characterized as ordered liberty. Ordered liberty, you know, decently and in order. Ordered liberty. Meaning what? Well, he would agree with Luther that in principle we are free men and women. That's part of the liberation which comes through justification and grace and so forth. But at the same time, it is obvious, Calvin would say, even when we are free from all kinds of things that, for example, bound Jews at the time of the Old Testament, we still have in the Decalogue, above all, guidance from God as to what is proper behavior. And therefore, in Calvin's mind, the liberty which was appropriate for Christians was liberty which was in keeping with God's law. Liberty which was in keeping with God's law, which was not license, in other words. Now, the fascinating thing about this, and I'm literally on my last sentence or two here, is the following. When you look at the history of Calvinism and more broadly Reformed political life in the 16th and 17th century and beyond, but especially in that period, it's a fascinating dialectic. Students of the history of Reformed political activity, political activism, have oftentimes said these people naturally were drawn to rebellion against the French king, rebellion against the Spanish king when he interferes in the Netherlands, and then of course on this and rebellion against English monarchs, and then on this side of the Atlantic, rebellion against English monarchs and rebellion. So they were, in a sense, naturally the party of rebellion, and yet, now to complete the dialectic, when they got any influence or power, they were the party of order. They were the party of maintaining order and trying as much as possible, and they put enormous value on order, trying to create conditions which enabled people to live orderly lives, and they associated orderly living with righteousness. I promised you that we would end by 10:30, and we're done for the moment. I want to say that we'll take a break here for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk some about all of this. So let's take 5 minutes to think about your questions, and then I'll begin to entertain those and hear your comments as well. But let's stop for 5 minutes. All right, the floor is open. Let's get some questions and comments on either the Reformed political tradition or Calvin, or both. If I skipped over something too quickly, or if it's not clear, or questions of that kind too.
Bruce?
Yes.
As I recall, Calvin had the idea, at least at some point, of converting the French monarchy to, well, at least Protestantism through, as I recall, an aunt or a sister of the monarch. And that strikes me as being, on its face, a little bit inconsistent with his position on government as you've laid it out.
Well, that's a good question. And let me just amplify. I don't think it's inconsistent, but what I need to do is to clarify a bit more fully his position. I think, keep in mind, the goal for somebody like Calvin is to get somebody in a position of power who's got the right religious commitment. This is a struggle for control of whole societies. If it was the case, as it was briefly in England, that you were able to find somebody who could rise to a monarch, who could rise to power, who was committed to the reform cause or anything close to the reform cause, sure, go for it. And that certainly was the shape of his thinking for a while with regard to France. And keep in mind, he dies in 1564 before the real struggle emerges in France. And he writes, you may remember, a very interesting preface, a dedicatory preface to the Institutes, the first edition of the Institutes, which is addressed to the king. And it's an appeal to the king. And basically he's saying there are two things. One is there's been a lot of slander of the cause with which I've identified. I want to clear that up. We're not anarchists. We're not anarchists. There are people maybe in the Protestant camp who are anarchists. We're not. We believe in civil authority and so on and so forth. So he appeals to him with the hope that at the very least that campaigns against Reformed Christians will cease. And the other thing, and I think you're referring to this, he had a rather long correspondence with a woman called Marguerite of Navarre. And by the way, Marilyn Robinson has written a wonderful essay on the relationship between Marguerite of Navarre and Calvin, who was a sister of the king, and therefore in a very good position to influence things. And she was committed to the reform cause. And for a while, the hope was that she would be able to influence the king in the right way, perhaps even move him directly into affirmation of the reform cause. That turned out to be unsuccessful. And so over time, Calvin, I would say, if I had to summarize this position, I would say we need somebody who is sympathetic to the reform cause. And if it's going to be a monarch, if it needs to be a monarch, fine. But the preference is for something different. I would put it that way. And it's this mixed regime that ultimately was the thing that later figures, we'll talk about the Puritans in just a moment, later figures glean from him as the thing which was the most desirable. And by the way, just one final thought on that. Through, I would say, this whole period of the 16th and the 17th century, there were a number of reform thinkers who said, it's just enough that we get a constitutional monarchy. Not an absolute monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy. And that, of course, relates to one of our big themes in this course, and that is the whole idea of constitutionalism. But if they really got power, and had their druthers, they would move in the direction of something like a mixed regime. Other questions?
Hi, Bruce. This is Wayne.
Yeah.
Bruce, it strikes me, you were reviewing the reasons for the flood of writing in that 140-year period. And I missed the third point. I think it was something to the effect that there was a desire to write down these views more so than any other time. Am I correct?
No, I think that's true, by the way, Wayne. I think there is a kind of let me state something I haven't touched on up to this point. There is an enormous, going back to the very beginning of the Reformed tradition, not just in politics, but in religious matters as well. There's an enormous emphasis on education, on the importance of people being educated, women and men, to be educated. So they're constantly creating schools and why? Well, because this is a literate form of Christianity. This is one which really emphasizes the word. So the people who are attracted to this are kind of naturally drawn in the direction of, with politics as with other things, articulating their views in a fairly elaborate written form. But the point I was making, it seems to me the other thing which is striking about not only do they find a need to acquire political power and a high value that they place upon politics, but also as they move into this and work it through, they sense more and more that they are innovating. And it's the sort of inclination to innovate more and more self-consciously that also I think is behind the writing. The writing is a way of defending their innovative views against the weight of tradition.
Well, how far were these innovative views filtered down into the people? This strikes me as a dialogue or an exercise of the intelligentsia and the thinkers and the church leaders, and that rather than the broader masses of people.
Well, it's a great question, and here's my answer to it. All along, Reformed Christianity appealed to people who were drawn to this way of life, which was heavily rooted in education. And therefore, in their own communities, it was uncommon for somebody not to have some significant degree of education. Just to give you a kind of joke that's sometimes told, that Massachusetts Bay Colony had a kind of more educated people in it than most of the cities of England. Because why? They were people of that sort. That was one of their defining peculiarities. And keep in mind, much more than our church life now, church life then for them was very much a kind of cerebral experience. Sermons which were cast as much in the form of philosophical discourses as they were exegesis of scripture. So who are the masses? The masses are frankly upper middle class people in this movement, upper middle class people who generally are rather well educated and aspire to even greater education. And frankly, that's part of what makes them such an effective force, because they are, when they're committed to something, they are committed with an enormous amount of focus, the focus that comes from having these shared, rather sophisticated ideas. Now, let me just jump ahead. One of the big criticisms of the Reformed tradition, let's take it in America, the Puritans and all that they represent, or the Presbyterians in the middle colonies for that matter, is precisely that their brand of religion is not for the masses. And so when you get this evangelical surge, especially with the Second Great Awakening, but even the First Great Awakening, the idea is, let's have a form of religion which is less cerebral and more sort of emotionally appealing, but in the process, what? Drained of some of the intellectual seriousness and sophistication. That's where, if you wanted to sort of define the turning point, and you're going to have reading next week about this, the turning point from sort of old-fashioned Reformed religion and politics to something more approaching what Christianity has become in our time, in our part of the world. The turning point is this shift, sort of carried out by people who call themselves evangelicals.
Bruce, we have a question in the chat from Doris Mabry, and you mentioned that Geneva had become a republic, and the question is, more generally, during this period, were there any democracies as we understand democracies?
You're testing the limits of my knowledge, Doris. I can expect that kind of question from Doris, and that's a compliment. To my knowledge, no. That's one of the most important things to grasp here. So let me use this question as a way of democracy was generally viewed by people as a bad idea. At least it was viewed by people who had any chance of acquiring political power as a bad idea. Now, the thing which is a good idea increasingly for especially the kind of people I was just discussing is republics. Republic is a form of popular government which is not fully democratic. I mean, we'll get to that later, but and almost without exception, the actual conduct of public life until the 18th century, until the 1700s, is something that would fall far short of anything that we would recognize as democracy. Indeed, one of the great themes of a lot of writing, absolutist writing, as it's characterized now, especially absolute defense of absolute monarchies, is the best thing in the world is to keep the hoi polloi, the masses, out of politics. That's the last thing we want them to do. Now, our spiritual forebears were cautiously moving, it seems to me, in another direction. Final point on this is there is a surge of democratic sort of thinking and practice on the left wing of Puritanism at the time of the Puritan Revolution in the 1640s. And it was very quickly suppressed by fellow Puritans. And it tended to be working class people outside the realm of sort of the mainstream of Puritan thought. People who were kind of drawn to the Puritan cause, but didn't have nearly the education that the vast majority of Puritans had. And they were the ones who said, we want the people to govern.
So Bruce, may I ask a quick question? So the purpose of education then is not to change your station in life, but only to deepen your piety?
Purpose of education is multiple. That's a wonderful question. And I would say the purpose of education is multiple. Keep in mind that it was a rather innovative idea to say the vast majority of people should be educated somewhat. That's a big innovation. Now, in relating this to the earlier question that was posed to me, the people who were drawn to a kind of opportunity that would expand the educated population were precisely the sort of people who were drawn to Reformed Christianity. They were middle-class people, and they had a desire to improve their station in life, but also to become better educated. Now, that having been said, I think they would say, and there's a lot of writing that's another topic on which they had a profusion of writing in this period. I think they would say the education has two or three purposes. One is generally to equip people to understand their faith better. Religion is a very important part of this, the religion of the word. Well, in order to be able to appreciate the religion of the word, you've got to read and write and learn and listen to learned sermons and so on and so forth. That's the whole body of the congregation. And education is required in order to do that. So part of education is precisely to equip people to study the Bible in a serious way. That's one thing. A second thing is to acquire the skills necessary to live a civilized life. Everything from raising children to participation in politics, a civilized life. And that means being conversant not just with the Bible, but what I think broadly would be characterized today as humanistic learning. The Reformed people who were very interested in people learning some of the classics, for example. That was part of the educational purpose. And then a third purpose was, where necessary, to acquire an education that would enable you to practice a trade. If you will, the thing which is now just looming so large in people's minds when they think about higher education, in particular, getting a trade. So I would say all of those things, Mary. And the thought was that a well-rounded education would deliver on all those things. Pam, can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Okay. There was a new form of social media there that I think the Reformed people were really good at using, and that was the printing press. And there was even one in Geneva, I think. So you have any comments on that influence?
Well, wonderful question. Boy, you understated. Geneva printing books was and other printed materials was big business in Geneva. As a matter of fact, some people have said that one of the reasons that Calvin wrote so much was because the people who were printing his stuff in Geneva couldn't wait for another manuscript from him to get it out so that they could sell it. So Geneva came to be known as a place where sort of the printed word was made ever more expansively available. And by the way, in more than one language, in multiple languages. There were several centers. Amsterdam became another one, places in England and so forth. Edinburgh was another one where printing became a big business, typically pursued by people of the Reformed faith. Now, I think the availability of those writings, let me just step back and say that, as you know well, I'm just going to restate something which we all know, that goes back at least to the 1520s. Luther prevailed in part because of his very successful exploitation of the printing press. Very successful exploitation of the printing press. And he too also was very shrewd about this. As a matter of fact, there's a wonderful book, and I can't remember the title of the person who's the author of the book, but it's something like Brand Luther, a recent book, which talks about he too became a kind of a source of an enormous industry of people publishing his writings. Now, the interesting thing is, a lot of those writings would have had a much wider audience if he'd been in the Reformed world. Why? Because to a large extent, the base of support for Lutheranism was people who were very limited in their education. That was one of the practical differences between the Reformed tradition and Lutheranism, which, keep in mind, Lutheranism in much of Europe during that period was much more attractive to peasants who not only didn't have much education, but were not drawn to education in the same way. I think that's one of the, just as an aside, I think it's one of the most fascinating distinctions between people. There are some people, and I'm guessing they're on this call, there are some people who are just drawn to education, drawn to serious ideas. They sort of enjoy it. And to state the obvious, there are other people who aren't. And I think at the time of the Reformation, with the emergence of the printing press and the emergence of these opportunities to learn in that way, those differences become dramatically apparent. Let's take one more before going on to the next topic. Yes.
Can you say anything about the New Testament influences on Calvin's thinking that affected his views on government?
You people are wonderful. You asked just the right questions. Here comes another one. This is a big divide in the Protestant world. The Reformed were the people in the Reform movement were very inclined to take the Old Testament above all seriously in thinking about politics, maybe for obvious reasons. This is a debate which goes beyond my pay grade, but let me just say, I think it's not as obvious as it might be that the New Testament is relevant to politics in a way that the Old Testament is. The Old Testament has got an elaborate body of political experience and political ideas. Now, the Reformed people in particular were, it's going to go too strong to say they didn't privilege the Old Testament. That would be too strong. But they were very respectful of what they took to be the sort of political example of the Israelites and the ideas connected with that. So much so that the Puritans, for example, were sometimes characterized as Protestant Jews or Jewish Protestants because of that stuff. Now, I'm just winding up to answer your question. So there is much less attention to the New Testament as a basis for thinking about political problems in the Reformed tradition until late. And the figure above all who makes a difference here is Karl Barth. You're going to read Karl Barth. By the way, I think this essay that I'm going to ask you to read for next week is one of the most important contributions that's ever been made to the Reformed tradition. With Barth, you get a rather strong emphasis on the New Testament. But for the longest time, the New Testament was treated as secondary to the Old Testament in the Reformed tradition. And to complete the point, that distinguished them dramatically from the Anabaptists. Who basically said the Old Testament is not relevant to our life experience. We're gonna found a whole way of thinking about things that privileges the New Testament. I never will forget some adult education session that took place in our church some years ago, and we have some Mennonites in our church, people of Mennonite background, and they just sometimes in those discussions scratch their heads. When the discussion is not focused single-mindedly on the Sermon on the Mount, for example. Let's focus on the Sermon on the Mount and not worry about all that other stuff. So at some point, one of these people said, well, why are we paying all this attention to the Old Testament? And then, some of us launched into this discourse that I'm now engaged in with you. And that's just I'm so glad you brought that topic up, because it is a fundamental part of the Reformed tradition. There's always been a deep respect for things from the Old Testament that was not characteristic of them in particular. Thanks for raising that. And believe me, that's the short answer. I could talk more, but that's the kind of thing you learn by looking at these texts. All right, let's begin to move on, and let me talk about the latter readings that you did. Can I proceed, or does anybody have one last comment to make or question to pose? Going once? All right, Larry, let's launch into the second chapter, the second part of this. And I want to talk about these two different readings as examples of later stages in the development of Reformed thought. That is post-Calvin. The first one still is within the foundational period, and that is Winthrop. He's writing in the 1630s, still the 17th century. The other one, Benjamin Rush, is not. He is he's writing in the 18th century, the late 18th century, 1780s specifically. And he's in these readings and in our topic for discussion for us, because he's very much a Reformed thinker who is responding to developments that are taking place in what is emerging as the United States of America in the late 18th century. The first of these figures, I would say, represents a further further development of the foundational ideas. The second one represents some significant changes in the foundational ideas. So first Winthrop, and then Benjamin Rush. Just a brief contextualizing remark. The English Puritans pursued the Reformation project in two very different ways. The English Puritans pursued the Reformation project in two different ways. In England itself, they actually made a revolution. They seized power. Indeed, not only did they seize power, but they executed the king. As I've said before, it's not a joke. It's just something to comment on. After a long prayer meeting, they executed the king. It's really kind of amazing. It was, in their minds, an act of righteousness. After went through much of the night, they prayed about it, and in the end, they executed the king, which of course shocked the vast majority of Englishmen once they heard about this. It made an impression, and not entirely good impression, on their fellow countrymen. That revolution, in part because of their execution of the king, ultimately failed. The revolution was done within 10 years. It led to the rule of Cromwell, but ultimately what I have in mind when I say it was done was by 1660 you have, with wide approval, the restoration of the monarchy. The restoration of the monarchy, the very thing they were trying to change, get rid of the monarchy, or at least sort of remake the monarchy in terms that made sense to them. That was gone, and it was replaced by the Restoration era. However, even though you might say they failed, a revolution that doesn't really change things the way you want them to be changed, that's a failed revolution, I think. They lost power. The people they despised came back into power. The people whom they despised wielding power and wielded it in a way that was very, involved a lot of suppression of Puritans. So they were victims ultimately. But within decades, another revolution took place, 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution that brought William and Mary to power in England. And that, in effect, was a kind of echo of Puritan ideas. What happened there? The rise of constitutional government in England, the triumph of Parliament over the monarchy, which had been something that the Puritans had been seeking for a long time. And you can say, therefore, that even though they lost the thing that they were trying most to accomplish, their ideas through that indirect way, that is the Glorious Revolution, as it was called, had a lasting impact on English politics. That's one way that they pursued. Go after power, take control of Parliament. If Parliament gets in trouble with the king, raise an army and have a civil war. That's part of the Reformed tradition in England. The other way that they pursued their project was to leave, exit, leave the country, and go to what we now think of as New England. And their strategy there was so different. It was to create, we all know this, American History 101, there was to create new communities in which they could pursue their project without having to worry very much about control, direction, attacks from the civil authorities on the other side of the Atlantic. It wasn't quite that simple, but not far from it. They were given a pretty free hand to develop what came to be known as Massachusetts Bay Colony. Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then later, of course, Rhode Island and Connecticut. The foundations for New England were laid there. Now, John Winthrop is part of that second project, going to the other side of the Atlantic and creating, and this is a key phrase here because they use it all the time, their attempt to create a holy commonwealth in Massachusetts. The dates on John Winthrop are the following. He was born in 1544 and he died in 1648. 1544, loosely a contemporary of John Calvin, but of course of another generation. He was just a kid when Calvin is wielding influence in Geneva. He's really influential in the 1630s and 40s on the other side of the Atlantic. But a man who's very much aware of Calvin, very much aware of this Reformed political tradition that I've been describing, but very much standing in it. He's a lawyer. He comes from a prosperous family. By the way, one of the things that's implied in some of the things I said earlier is that generally the Puritans were rather prosperous people. They were prosperous people who were very serious about their religion, among other things. Or another way to put it is to say, they thought life was not about enjoying life. Life was about doing something serious with your life. John Winthrop was the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he was a governor for 12 of the years that he remained in the colony to the time of his death. And this is the society, and I want to stress this. Massachusetts Bay Colony was set up in such a way that elected public officials had to face re-election every year. Every year. You don't want those governors to get too far out of control. Every year. This is a society which is not completely democratic, but it is rather democratic, and it is more democratic than anything in Old England. Let's stress. Again, in her writing on this, Marilyn Robinson does a wonderful job of making that point over and over and over again. New England was far more democratic than Old England. And it was, in that sense, a kind of living embodiment of a version of the form of government which was developing in the Reformed tradition as the right way to proceed. So a lawyer, a layman, take note, a layman, and a public official who obviously became one of the leading officials of the time. There were clergy with whom he worked, like John Cotton, Thomas Hooker, and so forth, but he was by far the most distinguished and most important lay figure. He's not one of the greats in terms of writing treatises. I assigned this particular body of reading for two reasons. One, because it is very representative of the way Puritans thought, and it has, of course, I'm sure all of you picked this up, this little text, Model of Christian Charity, has enormous historical significance in American politics, especially that business at the end about the city set on a hill and all that. This is the text. There's some debate about whether he ever delivered this sermon. Maybe that's too much historical research. But in any case, he wrote it, and it certainly was treated early on by Puritans in New England as a kind of authoritative statement of what they were about. So he's not one of the greats, but he's a very representative figure, in the thinking in this little piece is very representative of the way in which English Puritans on this side of the Atlantic thought of their project. Title of it, of course, is A Model of Christian Charity, and it is about charity. And I would say it is about Christian charity and its implications for public life. That would be my characterization. It's a discussion of the implications of Christian charity for public life. And I would say in large part, not entirely, what he is doing in this work is articulating some of the implications of Calvin's ideas. He's working out some of the implications of Calvin's ideas, especially the idea of a holy commonwealth. He's articulating, I think, in a beautiful way, highly idealistic to be sure, but in a beautiful way, kind of the ethos of a Christian commonwealth, holy commonwealth. This is how things should be in the holy commonwealth. Now, I ask you to read it for the following reason. In this is an idea which became another idea that I haven't mentioned yet. Another idea which became a very important part of Reformed political thought and practice. And it's an idea which probably is familiar to many of us, but it doesn't appear, interestingly enough, in Calvin's political writings, but it emerges later, and it's beautifully expressed here, and that is the idea of covenanting. The basis of our public life is covenanting together. Going back to the exchange I had with Doug, this is an Old Testament theme in spades. You look at the history of Israel. What is it? It's a history of covenanting. And that's one of the lessons that Reformed political thinkers took from the Old Testament, that if you want to have a society constituted well, it should be a society in which there is active covenanting. Covenanting. And if your mind is jumping ahead, that's not unrelated to contracts and all that stuff that's going to come later. Covenanting, though, is and by the way, this is an idea which has hardly any resonance in Roman Catholic political thought. Hardly any. And it's going back to the exchange I had with Doug, it's one of the best manifestations of the power of the Old Testament example in Reformed thinking. Because what, in effect, the people in Massachusetts Bay Colony were saying is, we are, like the Israelites, we aspire to be a covenant people. Like the Israelites, we aspire to be a covenant people. Indeed, I'm reading just a little into the text, but not much. I think the implication is the people, or let me start that again. A people becomes a people by covenanting. That's the example of the Israelites. A people becomes a people by covenanting. And what is covenanting? It is promise making. I promise, you promise, and then once those promises are made, we attempt to hold one another to those promises. I promise, you promise. In this case, it is a triangular promise, or maybe more than a triangular promise. And let me just spell that out. It's people, the people, meaning the whole body politic, are making promises to one another to be a people of a certain kind. That's the first thing, to be a people of a certain kind. But there are also promises between the people and their rulers. And part of those promises are the rulers are going to rule in such a way as to enable us to be a people of that kind. And then, of course, the final element and the crucial element, all of these promises are made not only in the eyes of God, but with God. And of course, the Israelite example is powerful here. I will be your people, you, etc. It's almost a promise making between God and the people. They're all wound up together. Now, this, I want to suggest, is not explicitly democratic. It's not like somebody is sitting there saying, all right, and who's going to vote? It's more a metaphor. It's more a metaphor for how things are, although there's a lot of voting going on. You know, John Winthrop has to face the electorate every blooming year. There's a lot of voting going on. But especially in terms of thinking about the foundations of the community. This is a kind of metaphor which is used by these people to describe their life together and the way in which that life is conducted. It's not explicitly democratic, although clearly the implication is all of us together. And for that reason, I would characterize it as proto-democratic. Proto-democratic. It is an anticipation of what becomes a more explicitly democratic theme later. So this is roughly a half century after John Calvin. I hope you see. It's roughly a half century after John Calvin. If you've read Calvin and then you read this, I hope you sense the sort of the connection, the resonance of the one with the other. And I would characterize this, still being part of the foundational period, as a development and not a revision. This is just adding something else, which was not there at the beginning, but which is certainly in keeping with what was there at the beginning. And I want to stress, it's almost, you can't exaggerate the importance of the idea of covenanting in the actual conduct of Reformed politics. Think, for example, of the Covenanters in Scotland. Think, for example, of, well, let me complete this with, once this gets up and running, it typically translates into something else, constitutional documents. Constitutional documents. In 1640, in 1641, while Winthrop was still alive, there was a document produced by the colony, which was a kind of list of rights that were to be honored as part of the covenant, a list of rights. The early version of what might be characterized as a Bill of Rights in, again, New England, long before the American founding. All right, that's Winthrop. Now, what about Rush? As I said at the beginning, Rush is a very important figure in my judgment, and should be better known by Presbyterians because he's very much a Presbyterian than he is. He's one of my heroes. Benjamin Rush was a physician, and a very distinguished physician. He actually was such a distinguished physician that he became one of the founders of the first medical school in the United States at the University of Pennsylvania, what we now think of as the University of Pennsylvania. He was also a very, very forward-looking thinker who pioneered the American Psychiatric Association recently recognized him as the founding father of psychiatry in the United States, even though there was no such thing as psychiatry at the time. But he had this idea that there was such a thing as mental health, which was different from physical health, and had various ideas about how it could be cultivated and promoted. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a public figure. He was a political activist. He was a physician, had a successful career as a physician, but also as a public figure. He was not part of the group that created what we now know as the Constitution of the United States, but he was a very strong advocate of it and was very instrumental in bringing about its endorsement in the state of Pennsylvania, which was crucial to the political process. He was one of the main men making those arguments. This is something which needs to be affirmed. He was a graduate of the College of New Jersey, which most of you know is Princeton. And then after an apprenticeship, he very much wanted to go into, he came from lower middle class origins, by the way, in Philadelphia. He wanted to go and practice medicine, and he had an apprenticeship with a local physician who urged him to get formal training. And he went to Edinburgh and got that formal training at Edinburgh. So Princeton and Edinburgh. And Edinburgh at the time was known to be one of the best centers for medical education in the world. Now, he is a man who is very self-consciously reformed, spent his life as well, let me say one other thing about his politics, which is very important. He was an abolitionist. He was an abolitionist at a time when I would say most of, not all, but most of the founding fathers were not. He's one of the founding fathers, and he was an abolitionist. And he was a pretty strong abolitionist who said, slavery's got to stop right now. That was not a popular opinion among the founding fathers. You know, I'm sure every one of us has read enough and heard enough about. Betty and I heard the other evening this wonderful show that PBS has done on Benjamin Franklin. And toward the end of that, there's a discussion of Franklin coming to his abolitionist views late in life. And there's a discussion there of the politics of abolitionism in relation to the Constitution and so forth. I'd love to know what the conversations between Benjamin Rush and Ben Franklin were, because they're both guys from Philadelphia. And Benjamin Rush was not a Johnny-come-lately to abolition. He just, from the start, from the public record, was this is wrong and it's got to stop. So he was noteworthy in that respect as well, and active in abolitionist causes. You're going to be reading somebody next week who comes from a later stage in the development of Reformed and Presbyterian abolitionist thinking. Very well read, very learned. Mary asked me a really good question about education, and I tried to answer it. And I would say Benjamin Rush was just a perfect example of all of that. That is education for life, for religion, for politics, for trade. All of that he would be picking up. The address to the people of the United States comes from 1787. He's a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's now seen, I'm sure you know the chronology here, but let me just remind you of a couple of facts. He, like others, has seen the way things are developing in the newly created republic. That's the word they used. They didn't call the United States government a democracy. That was not the term. The preferred term at the time was republic. The new American Republic, he had seen how things were unfolding in the years after the adoption of the Articles of Confederation, and he didn't like so many others, at least of his ilk, what was happening. He saw the Articles of Confederation as a recipe for weak government at a time when something stronger was needed. Let me say that again. Weak government. That's the great impulse for rewriting the Constitution, for redoing what the Articles of Confederation represented. I don't think it's in the word confederation is a perfect word, a confederation, which of course has other connotations later in American history. This was a confederation of states which essentially assumed their autonomy, assumed their sovereignty with very few limits. And that, from the point of view of people like Rush, who in his thinking becomes what is known as a federalist, thinks there's got to be a stronger national government if the country is going, if the republic is going to survive. Republic, if you can keep it. If the republic is going to survive, you need something different from this loose confederation. You've got to bring things into, you've got to reconfigure the governmental structures of the United States in such a way that there's stronger central authority, but now let me complete that sentence, stronger central authority, but not so strong as to be tyrannical. Stronger central authority, but not so strong as to be tyrannical. That was the great challenge. And these were, let me just say, I am not an uncritical in my thinking about the Constitution, but I have to say, these were remarkably skilled, knowledgeable people involved in that project. When you compare them with, say, other figures who were trying to do something similar, this was a kind of remarkable gathering of people. I would say, and let me just add here before getting into the details, I would say if you had to summarize the influences that brought about first the revolution, but then even more the Constitution and the form of government it created, I would say those influences came from two sources: Enlightenment thinking, represented by people like Thomas Jefferson, and Reformed political thought, represented by Rush, Witherspoon, to some extent Madison, and others I could mention. There was a very strong Reformed political influence in the American founding. And given what I've been talking about this morning and what you're reading, I think you can begin to feel that influence. The address of the people of the United States is an appeal to fellow Americans to go along with the thinking which is now going to produce in that year or two the new Constitution, the Constitution which will replace what the Articles of Confederation have provided. I want to suggest there are three things that are important there initially that are developments out of this tradition in which Rush very much stands. The first is he is very explicitly a devotee of republicanism. He is a republic man. He characterizes the American experiment as a republic. He makes explicit what you might say has previously been implicit in Reformed thinking about politics. We are devotees of republics, meaning an independent, self-governing society. An independent, self-governing society. And the most important meaning of the word republic at that point is not a monarchy. You're a republic man, you're opposed to monarchy. You don't want monarchy, none of that. You want an independent, self-governing society. Second, and here we go into something that we're going to be talking about on and off throughout these 4 weeks. He's a devotee of liberty in the Republican sense. Liberty in the Republican sense. You may know that many of the people who were associated with this project called themselves Sons of Liberty. So liberty becomes now a very important thing. It wasn't so much earlier in the development of Reformed political thought. I've mentioned it as a theme which is there somewhat in Calvin, but it's over time becomes more and more important. And then the comments he makes, which are very suggestive about how you achieve this government which is stronger but not too strong. How would you do that? Let me just say parenthetically, one of the great things about the Founding Fathers is that they recognize that statecraft is complicated business. there's a tendency, and I'm going to label it now, especially the populist tendency, is to say this is simple stuff. Anybody can do it. Anybody who can perform the normal affairs of life can do this stuff. I'll stand in the Reformed tradition and say nonsense. It was already implied in Calvin's embrace of the idea of aristocracy. It was central to the thinking of the people who drafted the Constitution that it is very complicated, difficult stuff. So how do you do it? How do you create this form of government? And by the way, in this very novel circumstance of colonies spread out over an expanse that is as large as much a good part of Europe. Think about it. You know, these colonies spread out over this huge expanse of land with their cultural differences. How do you unify them? How do you make one nation of them? The answer that is implied in this very brief statement by Rush is the answer, of course, which was developed much more by people like James Madison and others in the Federalist Papers, but it's clearly implied here. Avoid unicameralism. Avoid unicameralism of investing power in one legislative assembly. Avoid unicameralism. And create a form of government which mixes democratic and aristocratic elements. Think about the design of the American Constitution. That's precisely what's going on here. A mix of democratic and aristocratic elements. And let me add here, he implies something here which has not really been a theme up to this point in Reformed political thought, becomes an important theme largely, but not entirely, because of the American experience, and I might add the Dutch experience, and that is the need for federalism. Federalism with different levels of authority, not just one central government, but layers of government, to some extent checking and balancing one another. Now, those are themes, I would say, which are developments of ideas that were already present in the Reformed political tradition, but they are adaptations of those ideas to this new circumstance of a huge nation in terms of land mass, and something which is clearly in Rush's thinking, even though he doesn't mention it here. This is a religiously pluralistic society. This is a religiously pluralistic society. That's a new element, and a terribly important element, as I'm sure all of you appreciate. Because it is the foundation out of which you get the idea of doing away with religious establishment and insisting upon religious liberty as a fundamental right. And by the way, let me stress, American Presbyterianism has its roots not in New England, but in the middle colonies. That was Rush's area, the middle colonies in the United States, which were pluralistic, much more pluralistic than New England. You had people of various different faiths rubbing shoulders with one another and dealing with one another almost from the get-go in a way that required respect for religious difference. Now, those are two things. That is something which is not mentioned here in this particular reading, but it's certainly something that Rush believed in. He believed in religious liberty. He believed in doing away with, whenever possible, the established church. Presbyterians in particular were very, very uneasy with the idea of an established church on this side of the Atlantic, because it meant probably the Church of England. It meant Anglicanism, and it meant something which would be what? Curtail, limit, even jeopardize the freedoms of other Protestant churches. Especially the Baptists and the Presbyterians were convinced that for those reasons, religious establishment was something which had to go. Let me say just on that point, one further point. He was not the first. Rush was by no means the first to to embrace that idea. Milton believed strongly in it. Algernon Sidney believed strongly in it. And there were others. So this was an idea which was already beginning to percolate before the time of the American founding. The last thing I want to just mention is, I think, a genuinely new development, but an extension of things which we've already talked about. All the way along in this tradition, there's an emphasis on the need for virtuous, pious leaders. Virtuous, pious leaders. Sometimes you hear, especially a certain kind of secular scholar will say, Madison and the founding fathers generally believed that if you just structured the institutions of government properly, everything would take care of itself. Nonsense. They all believed that the institutions of government needed to be constructed in the right way, but that would not in and of itself suffice. You also needed those institutions to be what? Populated by wise, virtuous leaders who enabled the institutions to serve their proper function. Now, that's been a theme. You saw it all the way back with Calvin, who said, you know, we've got to have, we got to think of public life as a calling. You've got to think about it as a ministry. Whoa, that's very lofty talk about civil officials. But here now we're going to get a new theme, which is kind of an extension of that and a variation on it, which I think is so important. And that is the need for an educated and virtuous citizenry, not just leaders, but citizens. An educated and virtuous citizenry. And of course, he even says that it would be good, Betty and I were talking about this last night, it would be good if we had a national university to make sure that the citizenry, not just the rulers, were able to get the proper formation. I hope you sense that this is a kind of adaptation of ideas that we encountered earlier to this very different situation that exists in the 18th century. And one of the great things about this tradition is that it has had people all along responding to this new situation and that new situation and some other situation who would take this set of foundational ideas and adapt them creatively to the new circumstance. The readings you're going to do for next week are all examples of that. You know, one from the 19th century, one from the early 20th century, one later in the 20th century. They all are designed to illustrate that. Now, let me stop. We've got, I hope, a good few minutes here for me to entertain your questions and comments. Floor is open. I see.
Can't hear you, Pam. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Pam. Can't hear you.
Now too back. Okay, now I'm unmuted. You were talking about a university, a national university that he suggested. But a few years ago, a bunch of years ago, I read a book on the different founders of the writers of the Constitution, and it struck me how many of them did have some sort of a college or university education, much of which was received in this country. And I was trying to count up the number of colleges that existed in the country at the time of the Revolution, and they were not bereft. So I was just wondering why he felt they needed another one.
Well, I think it's the question that was posed in a different way by Wayne. I think, who maybe I'm getting a little, my memory is failing me on this, but I think they are already beginning to see in the late 18th century that we're moving in the direction of more participation by the vast majority of people, at least vast majority of free men. That's the way it starts. In the affairs of government, and therefore It's not enough just to have wise and well-educated leaders. So this is a anticipation, if you will, of what will become more and more an issue. So, but I take your point. I mean, I think the level of education of those people was pretty extraordinary. That is, the people who were part of the founding level of it, and they were very well educated, not just about the subject matter that we're interested in here, but many other things as well.
And I guess you could argue that public policy, as the country went on in the next centuries, actually more supported the state development of universities rather than
exactly.
Yeah,
that's exactly what happened. And I think that's related to. He also is kind of wary about the expansion of the country. Good luck with that, because the expansion becomes one of the great topics. I saw Bill Malone's hand.
Going back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the John Winthrop, toward the latter part of Winthrop's term, as I understand it, there was a great reflow of Puritans from Massachusetts Bay Colony to England. And to what extent was that doctrinally related, and to what extent was it simply a dissatisfaction with the puritanical nature of the Massachusetts government?
The simple answer is I don't know. But I will say, I think it's important to understand that the collection of people who were gathered at the beginning was not uniformly people who were Puritans in anything like the full sense. So it's understandable that when they create a society which is dedicated to the religious purposes that I identified earlier, there's going to be some unhappiness with that. So it doesn't surprise me at all that the thing that you described did in fact occur. And of course, it becomes even more of an issue. This is famous, there's literally lots of writing on this, when the transition to the next generation takes place. That's an important part of the Puritan story. But Bill, I just simply don't know the answer to your question. Doris.
I found it really interesting that when you were talking about the doing away with the established church because of the middle colonies being more religiously plural. I had always thought that the reason was because the original people coming here came from countries where that was an established church and they were persecuted because of their religion. And I would tend to think that those people in the middle colonies, the plurality didn't have to do with, it had more to do with plurality within Christianity than it had to do with plurality among religions in general. Is that true?
I'm not. I don't fully understand the distinction you're making.
I mean, there weren't a lot of like Muslims and Hindus and stuff in the middle colonies.
Absolutely. You know, there's a little bit of that kind of religious pluralism, but just a bit, just a tiny bit.
Because I would think with the slaves, many of them coming from Africa had Islamic backgrounds.
Probably so.
But they weren't really being considered.
Absolutely, they were not being considered. They were not considered at all.
No, they were.
The Jews would have been considered, wouldn't they?
What?
I said the Jews would have been considered.
Yeah. Considered and not considered. There's a very important theme that begins to emerge. We'll talk about it more next week. Of this is a Protestant country, and if you're here, a white Protestant country. This is a white Protestant country, and if you're here and you have another faith, well, we'll make allowances for that. But fundamentally, we're in charge. But let me go back to your point. It's absolutely true to say that there were in the middle colonies most of the variety had to do with fellow Christians, not other religions. And I would say even Roman Catholics were considered rather marginal to what the real issue. The real issue was differences among Anglicans and Presbyterians and Baptists, above all, Quakers, though absolutely Quakers, those four. And at that time, those differences really mattered. And mattered so much that there was, of course, on the other side of the Atlantic, religious repression connected with this. But you know, when they find themselves settling in the middle colonies with the background you described, it's not to be taken for granted that they will get along. It's not to be taken for granted even that they will work out some kind of accommodation, as opposed to trying to grab for power so that one of them prevails. And so I think it's important to note that there were people, and Rush is one of them, Franklin was another, but there were a whole series of people who really steered the flow of thinking and events in the direction of what became the embrace of disestablishment and freedom of religion. I think it's important to stress that that was a big difference from New England. They may have come over here out of with a lot of religious victimization of their own. But once they got over here, what they were trying to do is to create a holy commonwealth. They were not trying to create a place where people of a variety of different beliefs could live happily. No, that wasn't the motive. The motive was, I would say, pretty much in Calvin's sense, a holy commonwealth. That was not, shall we say, a pluralistic idea. And in the southern colonies, of course, the Anglicans tended to dominate. And there was, for example, in Virginia, there was a lot of tension, conflict between the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Anglicans, because the Anglicans insisted upon controlling the way in which, for example, clergy could function in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So you have, if you will, three cultures. The southern colonies, one kind of religious establishment, New England, another kind of religious establishment, and then the middle colonies are the place where the experimentation with something else is taking place. Robert Harris.
Bob is fine.
Okay.
I'm curious about looking at the piece you sent about by Rush. He says something to the effect that he, on the one hand, says something about he wants the president to be chosen, voted on annually by the Privy Council, and then the next paragraph he says the custom of turning men out of power office as soon as they're qualified has been found to be absurd in practice, and that seems to be a little contradictory. Yeah.
Well, you know, it will not surprise you to hear that when you're writing something for a general audience and you're trying to appeal to them, sometimes you're involved in the practice of, on the one hand, but on the other. But I think don't you think it's pretty clear what his sentiments are? That is, he reflects something there which was very common at the time, and that is a great fear of an executive power. Mm-hmm. The executive power, and if I remember that correctly, he doesn't want executive power to be linked in any way to popular election. Now, that was a very common concern at the time. And he's writing this, of course, in anticipation of what will be the outcome. He didn't know what the outcome will be. But his view of a mixed regime, a republic, is one that has, my own view would be, too little appreciation of the need for executive power. And it grows out of all the ferment of the time. I think that's what would be the case.
Yeah, so he's really trying to hold in creative tension the importance of having people who are truly experts, and at the same time, people listening to ordinary people who are not experts but have maybe common sense or whatever.
Beautifully said. That's exactly right. That's exactly it. I can't imagine a better way of putting it. That's the point. Mm-hmm. Larry Goldman.
Thank you, Bruce. It's really productive, wonderful session this morning. I'm grateful to you. I had a question about Rush amidst other conversations regarding religious liberty. And thinking both geographically and in terms of kind of political theorists, people on the Anglican side like George Mason, of course Jefferson, who's more of a deist, and on the Catholic side, it's quite interesting that they are actually claiming to be the founders of religious liberty in this country, in the colony of Maryland. So their earlier attempt at self-protection in that is being turned into we were champions of religious liberty, which is, I guess, possible. I'm a bit suspect. So I just wanted to ask you about Rush in that conversation, and also the middle colonies. The one possible exception I could possibly think of in New England, of course, was Rhode Island, and its embrace of multiple faiths, including Catholics. Evidently, they were somewhat tolerated there after the Revolution, not so much before. Any comments on that, and the geography and the multi-denominational theorists?
Let me. I don't think I'm going to be able to say much that's helpful on the main point you raised, but let me just say a couple of things about the other parts. Through my association with Georgetown, I've come to be very aware of the sort of Catholic view of this matter, and you've expressed part of it, I think, quite well. That is that Maryland provided, not initially, but eventually, and it would be in ways that are relevant to the founding, an example of a certain degree of religious liberty and all that entails. So yes, so that is the basis of a Catholic claim, and there were people, John Carroll and others, who were sort of defending that in terms of the relevant ideas. However, the people who I think most, at least the well-informed Catholics about this, would admit the following: that religious liberty as a principle was not embraced by the Roman Catholic Church until Vatican II. Let me say that again. It was not embraced as a principle, nor in practice, in much of, especially the Catholic country. It was just not accepted. That's a huge difference. There's been and by the way, the figure who more than any other made that possible is somebody worth reading if we were making this a more ecumenical project, is John Courtney Murray, especially a book some of you may be interested in called We Hold These Truths, a Jesuit in the United States who was silenced for a while because of his shall we say, positive interpretation of the American founding as a contribution to, the way Christians generally should think about this matter. But his silencing ended in time for the Second Vatican Council, and he became, I think it's pretty clear, the main advisor to the people who crafted the famous Declaration on Religious Liberty. And by the way, that has had an enormous difference. Made an enormous difference. The Declaration on Religious Liberty and the opening up of Roman Catholics to acknowledging the legitimacy of religious pluralism has made it, you know better than I, an enormous practical difference, especially on historically Catholic countries. But let me add one final point on this. In the middle of that book, he says something, I just sat up and I thought, what? And the statement he makes is, religious pluralism is contrary to the will of God. Now that's a good Roman Catholic view. At least it was for the longest time. Our spiritual forebears were moving in a different direction. They just were. It took them a while to get to where I think they needed to be, but they were. And by the way, the question that's going to loom up here is, if you're dedicated at all to the idea of a holy commonwealth, how do you accommodate religious pluralism? Let me say that again. If you're dedicated to the idea of a holy commonwealth, then how do you accommodate religious pluralism? Stay tuned. We're going to talk about that some more. Let's see, Bill Malone.
Okay, you've had Betty and Tom have had their hands up, I think.
Well, let's get Bill. Let's get the Betty and Tom first. Betty, Tom.
Good morning. I want to ask you about the reform movement, and you're mentioning that they want virtuous and pious leaders in the civil society. I would say that our leaders initially in this country may have been virtuous, but I don't know very much about their piety, especially Thomas Jefferson. How did piety come into play, and was it a failure there?
Well, I think the answer that they would give you is most of the Reformed people were not enthusiastic about Jefferson. So the obvious thing is, once you set up this process in which the people have a say, sometimes you don't control it, to state the obvious. Now, that is only the beginning of the story, because then much of the rest of the 19th century is an attempt, and I would say largely a failure, not entirely, but largely a failure, to try to incorporate the idea of a virtuous and pious leadership into the politics of the United States. They don't give up on it, but they understand that it's not an easy thing to achieve, especially once you adopt a more, shall we say, pluralistic understanding of relationship between civil authority and religious authority. Yeah, I bring that up, Tom, because that was central to their thinking. And I hope I've made clear the point that even though they had a lot of concern about and wisdom about the structure of institutions, they never believed that the structure of institutions per se was going to be adequate. They always had this other view, that you needed to have a certain kind of leadership for those institutions to work well. Anyway, that's you put your finger on a huge problem.
I think Betty's next.
Betty.
My comments and question are probably more appropriate for later in this module, this course. So I'll just raise it now, and you can answer it later if you want to. When I was reading these three documents, I just kept thinking how quaint this all is. The concept that our civic leaders would be people of spirit, faithful people who have a calling, people who are working toward the common good, people who are working toward creating a holy commonwealth, people who are virtuous and pious. That seems so different from our current situation and how we view our political leaders. You said at the very beginning, of course, that the civic authorities in that time were horribly corrupt, and so they were not addressing people who could be characterized in this way. So what's the difference between when these people were writing and how we view civic authorities now? Is it because we've basically become so secularized as a society that we don't, our standards have been lowered or our standards have been changed? But in reading all three of those documents, I just kept saying, these three people are so different, that their goals and aims are so different from where we are today in our civic life.
Basically, I'm going to say stay tuned, as you anticipated. But let me just make one point. Starting with Calvin, and for a long time, these people said, "All right, you want a reformation? Here it comes. We know that there's all kinds of sinfulness and all kinds of corruption. That's not news to them. They would understand. I think they would have a perfect understanding of the latest, if they were presented with information about the latest malfeasance in public life, they would say, or whatever problem we've got in public life of that character. They would say, of course, we understand that. But we're about the project of reform. We're about the project of reforming not just the church, but the whole society. And we're going to, by God, we're going to pursue it. And part of it is changing fundamentally what kind of people are in charge and what kind of people we expect to be in charge. And I think there was a kind of conviction, and this is one of the things that sometimes people, more conservative people, Lutherans oftentimes criticize the Reformed tradition for its excessive optimism that something something of the kind they were looking for could be achieved. So they were intense about change in a certain direction, and that's part of the reason that they spoke the way they did. But stay tuned.
I think you had Bill waiting.
Yes, Bill.
If you want to take a few more questions, 2 more questions.
A couple more questions. We're out of time, but go ahead.
Well, I wanted to comment on Larry's remarks about Maryland. My understanding is that the governor's council didn't include Lord Baltimore because they never got here, but the nephews and all who were sent in as governors, they really excluded the non-Catholics for governmental roles. And when William and Mary took the throne in England, there were I don't know 110 men who marched from St. Mary's City, which was, I guess, the largest city then on the eastern shore, to Mattapanai, which was the seat of the governor of Maryland, and the Roman Catholics, of course, could count, and as a result, Maryland ceased to be a Roman Catholic colony.
Yeah, I think their claim is it was written in the charter they could not have an established church. That's basically their claim. But yeah, in practice, there was a lot of that going on that you said. Yeah, I think.
Did you call me?
Yeah, Pam.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was noticing, these are all very much kind of law and order, tough love kind of things, except I think it's Wolterstorff that occasionally mentions, collect your debts with love. It seemed a little bit, I could imagine some situations where you could be very cruel with love, but you were still doing it with love. And I just wondered how much did any of this love and mercy come in terms of practice as opposed to what's just written in the writings?
I can give a one-word answer.
What was that?
Some.
Not much.
But Pam, that's a good comment because you captured one of the themes here. This is a very much an order-oriented way of thinking. It's not just that, but that's a big part of it. Let me say a word or two about the readings for next week. We're out of time here. You're going to read Henry Ward Beecher. There's a book about him called The Most Famous Man in America. I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but in the 19th century, he was a very, very influential Protestant figure. And somebody who was a very strong abolitionist. You will get a sense of that, and see the influence of the country moving in a more democratic direction. The second is Abraham Kuyper, Prime Minister of the Netherlands, theologian, scholar, lawyer. I don't know when he ever slept. All kinds of, and he's a very important figure in the Dutch Reformed world, but I think he's a very important figure in the development of the Reformed political tradition for reasons that will become obvious to you. And then finally, this very important essay by, and I think not adequately, its importance is not adequately appreciated, by Karl Barth, the great Swiss German theologian. And that comes from his experience, comes out of his experience in the Second World War, struggle with the Nazis and all. And it's a statement that he made together with a couple of others on the issues that are of interest to us right after the conclusion of the Second World War. So I think we're done.
I want to thank Bruce for a stimulating and really, really in-depth session. I want to thank everyone for being so engaged and wonderful questions. And we'll look forward to seeing you all next week.
Have a good week.